Hello there. Today I'm going to be discussing Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. It is book one in the realm of the Elderlings in the Farseer trilogy. And today there might be some spoilers, so if you have not yet read the book, please do. It's a great book. And let's get into the video. I'm going to begin this review by talking a little bit about the writing. Now, there are a couple of things that I think make her writing so good. First of all, descriptions. She is really good at writing descriptions and conveying a sort of tone, that a very specific tone. It's sort of morose and somber and beautiful, and I just really like her writing. Just the description aspect of it. Another thing I think is consistency. You feel a pretty consistent feel throughout the novel, and I think part of that is due to her mastery over the first person point of view. It's incredible. She writes fits so well, partly because of just writing from her perspective, and you get to know Fitz so much better because of how well she writes it, and that sort of falls into both characters and writing, but she does an incredible job. And the last sort of piece I want to touch on a little bit is the dialogue, which I just think is really good as well. Now, the only reason it's not a 10 out of 10 is because I think sometimes it can be overly descriptive, and it's not as bad as some other books, but there are times when she just there are like paragraphs just explaining things a little bit, or like describing things, and not all of that is really important or necessary, and so it could be cut back on some, but that would also like take away some of just the beauty of the novel. So it's a tricky line. But those are my thoughts on the writing. Let's move on to the character. In my opinion, the two authors who are best at writing characters are George R. R. Martin and Robin Hobb, and it comes down to a couple of reasons. First of all, the dialogue. Now, I think Martin might be a little better at this than Hobb, but they both are really good at writing dialogue that really sets characters apart. Now, part of this is like how you read it in your head, but genuinely, like, the words choices would be different for different characters. They don't talk the same way. And I feel like that is something that a couple of my other favorite authors lack a little bit of. Sanderson. But I love Sanderson. It's okay. And then also the realism. I find that their characters are pretty realistic in the sense that they feel like human beings. They feel like people. But I also think Hobb writes the animals really well in differentiating them from people, but also making them still characters. Hobb does a great job. And then also they're likable. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but there are enough characters who I can really get attached to and care about. Even if I don't necessarily really like them, I can still understand them and root for them in some ways. And Hobb does a fantastic job with making you care about characters. For if you really just hate everyone in the story, people can still love that. There can still be some sense in that, and you can still really enjoy yourself. But that's just not really what I like as much. So obviously this is tailored to my opinion. But anyway, and then the last thing is just the POVs. Now this series is first person POV. Well, 3 out of 5 series in this one big series are. And I think Hobb just does an amazing job at writing Fitz's POV. Having read also the Life Ship Traders trilogy, I think there is such a difference between how she writes different characters. And her style always comes through a little bit, but Fitz feels so different from, say, Althea or Malta. And it's just incredible. So if you haven't guessed yet, I'm giving characters a 10 out of 10. I think Hobb is my favorite author. She is my favorite author. And part of that is because of how well she writes the characters. So, yes. Those are my opinions on the characters. For the most part. Let's move on. Now, in my opinion, the plot and the pacing are the weakest aspects of this book, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it feels like it's more like 3 stories and a couple of extra details instead of just one story. It doesn't fully go as a normal story would. Rather, it just feels like there's not one main plot for most of the book, and the ending feels rather abrupt, and it ends very suddenly, and the last bit feels very fast paced compared to the very slow pacing of the most of it, the rest of it. It feels like there are three stories, sort of Burrick and Shade, and then we have Galen, and then we have Jonpei. And there's more than that in um, in dispersed between the three, but those are the main ones. Um, at the start, we have Fitz very young, as he pretty much is just cared for by Burrick, learns to be in the stables, and then he sort of gets his own room, and then he's with Shade, and then we've got the Galen bit. Now this is where the tensions start to get higher, the stakes more is at stake, and we get to see Fitz starts to develop more into a character. Now it's interesting because he always feels like a interesting character because it's a framed narrative, and we get his details of him looking back on it. But in the beginning, he's a child. He's a blank slate, pretty much. And so seeing him sort of evolve within the Galen section is very interesting. And then we have Jonpei, which is very quick with the betrayal and all, and the death of Nosy and Rurisk, and it just goes by so quickly. But also it feels like she doesn't dwell on it enough. It feels rushed almost. But I still think there are some parts. I think it has a lot of important moments. I feel like a lot of emotional moments, certainly. And I still love it, but I think it is barely above average, or rather a little bit above average. I think this is better than a lot of stories out there as far as plot slash pacing, but worse than a lot of the great ones. So I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about, before we talk a little bit about the overall, I'm going to discuss the world. Now, this world is interesting because it's clearly, world building isn't the most important thing. It's more like a background detail and sort of like a set. But it's an interesting set, and it's so clear to me, at least, that Hobb knows what she's doing with the world. Yet it's just not the most important thing. She cares more about the characters and their places in the world than describing the world itself. And I'm much in the same boat, where I like world building, but I like it in the background, and I don't care about it as much when it's in the forefront. So I'm gonna give the world 7.5 because I feel like it's done well. It's just not focused on too clearly, and some parts are very typical. We've got a pretty medieval style world, but then we have the skill and the wit, which I absolutely adore. And then we have the sort of like some details about like the outer island, the outer islands. I think that's what they're called. Sorry, my memory is terrible. And Buckkeep and the Six Duchies, and it's interesting. And there are a lot of details, but they're not always the most important, but they're always interesting. So I'm gonna give the world, like I said, 7.5. Overall, using this rating system, the book earns an 8.25 out of 10, which is interesting because if you were to ask me without thinking of it as just a summation of its parts, I would say a 9.25. Why? I care much more about the character, how well done the characters are, than I do the world building, and I care more about a decent plot. If there's a decent plot, I care more about the writing, or if there's a great plot, I care less about the writing. It all depends on the book, and I think these are so much more than just the sum of all its parts. For example, I could give a book some pretty high scores and still hate it, and at the same time, I could love a book and give it some mediocre or poor scores. So that is pretty much all I have to say on this book. I absolutely love this. I've read it 3 times now, and I've also recommended it to almost all of my friends, and at least 3 people I've gotten to read it. So this exact copy. I'm actually surprised it's in such good shape, considering how much I've given it away. Well, lended it out. So thank you for watching this video, and until next time, farewell.